Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shailee, and I'm the news editor at the Fulcrum.
I'm Kavi, Achar, and I'm also a news editor at the Fulcrum.
Today we're interviewing Dr. Yipeng Ge, who has joined us today to talk about his suspension, which happened last semester, and him as a medical student and his experience at the University of Ottawa. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Could you talk a little bit about your experience in academic history with the University of Ottawa?
Yeah, so I started at the University of Ottawa as a medical student in 2016. I've been affiliated with the university ever since, doing medical school and then residency training in public health and preventive medicine. It's been about coming up on 8 years of my life, 4 years of medical school, followed by another 4 years of residency. The residency training itself is 5 years in total, so yeah, committed quite a bit of my life to this institution so far.
You were suspended in early November of last year. How did you find out that you got suspended?
So I'll preface things with there are certain things that out of respect for the process, and there are things even including the outcome of the decision that have been made confidential, and I've been actively having conversations with my legal counsel and trying to get clarification with the Faculty of Medicine as to what I can and can't say. And I think that will continue to evolve in the coming days and weeks. So what I can share will be, I think, based off of that. And maybe also flag that the School of Epidemiology and Public Health shared a Twitter post and also an Instagram post, I believe yesterday, welcoming me back with, I think, the assumption that people will interpret that to mean that I am reinstated. But to answer your question, I guess, as to how I was suspended, was I received a phone call by someone within the faculty on Sunday, November 5th, at 8 o'clock in the morning to tell me that I was suspended immediately.
And was there any type of paper confirmation or any email or anything that was sent with any instructions or follow-ups on that?
Yeah, the only information I was given from that meeting was a meeting minutes document. But unfortunately, the person that I spoke to was not involved in the decision to suspend me. So I actually have very little information to provide, as well as they couldn't provide the information around the grounds for my suspension, other than it be that it's related to social media posts.
And you would suspect that those social media posts are ones related to what's going on in Palestine and Gaza right now?
That's what I interpreted at that point, based off of another faculty member posting publicly about me on multiple social media platforms, and really taking some of my social media post content extremely out of context and framing it in a very inflammatory and negative way that's really harmful to, and that perpetuates things like anti-Palestinian racism.
I would say that yours is just one example of ways in which censorship in Canada regarding the situation has gone quite extreme in a lot of different institutions and places over the course of the past few months. Have you witnessed any other examples of censorship, maybe in the medical field, not necessarily relating to this particular current events situation, but just in general during your time at the University of Ottawa?
Not to this degree, right? And I think out of an abundance of protection for individual people's privacy and confidentiality, it makes a lot of sense for some of these processes to kind of happen and take place with as few people knowing about it as best as possible to kind of center and protect and support the individual that is maybe accused of something and until an investigation can take place. I think outside of the context of what we're seeing as of late, related to the conflict in Israel-Palestine, we're seeing a lot more acts of censorship and the perpetuation of anti-Palestinian racism through things like censorship to really make people feel isolated and afraid, to call attention to what is already being investigated at the International Court of Justice to be that of genocide, the Palestinian people in Gaza. And so when we have these things happening and people aren't able to feel comfortable speaking freely about it, and especially people within certain professions, including doctors, then it's extremely problematic. And what I have seen as of late is a pattern of silencing and also extremely negative and harmful rhetoric about people that are speaking about like very decent things, health and human rights for Palestinians in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and framing that in a very negative way and using different tactics and means to kind of take down people, whether it be medical students or residents, training to be full-fledged physicians. They're being taken down in certain ways, and then there are practicing physicians that have also been suspended from their work without pay. For example, like Dr. Ben Thompson has seen that as well. And so this is also not isolated to medicine. It's happening at law schools and the law profession and so many other workplaces that also don't get the same amount of attention, because if you lose your job at like a restaurant at Moxie's that lost their jobs. So like when those things happen, there's a lot less protections and sometimes less media and less organized efforts, especially if people are not unionized, for example, and things like that.
So you talked a lot about racism, Palestinian racism in the healthcare community. What do anti-racism policies at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Medicine look like?
It's a really good question. I think it's hard for me to speak like broadly or even specifically, because it looks very different based off of probably the faculty, probably depending on like the department or area of work, even within the institution as a whole. I think there was a lot of like, if we want to kind of call it this like racial reckoning movement, in summer of 2020, following the death of George Floyd in the United States, that rekindled kind of that movement for Black Lives Matter, really forced institutions to reflect and understand their complicitness of upholding anti-Black racism, which I think in large part sparked a lot of rhetoric around anti-racism efforts. Work has been ongoing since summer of 2020. I can't speak specifically towards like the university as a whole as to what they've been doing. But I know within like the Faculty of Medicine, I've worked on like anti-racism modules for the Department of Family Medicine, and that's getting different lived experiences of a lot of clinicians. I'm not sure if there are people with lived experiences involved, including patients, but to really have people reflect on their own kind of anti-racism journey and their own kind of unconscious biases that perpetuate harm in a clinical encounter environment, and to be in kind of a brave environment or space to be able to acknowledge those things. And how do you do that in a supported environment that allows for uncomfortable conversation to take place? And uncomfortable conversations doesn't mean like unsafe or harmful things to happen, but to be able to like reckon with our own individual biases, because we all have those, and how do you try to mitigate and acknowledge them so that you can center, in my work as like family doctor and my work as a public health physician, resident physician, it's about how do you do that work and center community and center patients, so that the work that you do hopefully does more good than harm. So that's what like anti-racism efforts look like, I think, a little bit within the Department of Family Medicine through those anti-racism modules. And then more broadly, I've done some anti-racism work with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. I was on their advisory committee for anti-racism for about 2 years, and I can only assume, maybe it was said at one point, that a lot of that work was sparked by the murder and death of George Floyd, and like institutions may be well-intentioned, but maybe also forced into a position to and sometimes they need to be forced and pressured by social movements, people actually using their bodies to protest and be on the streets to demand institutions to do better. And so I think it was a reflection of that. And then the Canadian Institutes of Health Research really had to reflect on how some of their research processes as a national funding agency for clinical and other health research in Canada had to do better with respect to different kinds of like equity, diversity, inclusion metrics, and who got funding, what kind of research was being funded, who made those decisions. And I think when we kind of look at those things from the really important reflective questions, we can try to move things in a better direction so that these organizations and as individuals within those organizations are more far along on their anti-racism journey. But it's a lot of individual work and organizational work, and it's from the macro to the micro, and then the other way around too. So it's challenging work, but I mean it's a lot of what I'm passionate about in medicine and public health work and research as well. So to also be called out for it and to have it be framed in such a negative light has been extremely harmful.
Have you witnessed or experienced racism in healthcare? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely pervasive, unfortunately, because healthcare is a service that happens within the broader context of, a settler colonial state that is so-called Canada that we are speaking from and at. And so, like, as a microcosm, kind of like community that is like healthcare or the medicine field, like, of course, we're going to see things that, as a broader society, we already know to be true in terms of like the creation of, the state of Canada was off backs of Indigenous people through like forceful displacement and the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And so when we think about also like some really important truths that have been reported through like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and like listening to the stories of residential school survivors, those that survived, right, many that didn't, as well, to acknowledge. That was the time when I entered undergrad training at McMaster University in the context of Hamilton and Six Nations, where I was learning a lot about Indigenous health and inequities and kind of grappling with my own identity as a settler, as an immigrant, and benefiting from a lot of harmful policies and the construction of various institutions that perpetuate those very violent, oppressive things. So it was within that context that I was learning about reports like First Nations second-class treatment, a report by Billy Allen and Janet Smalley out of the Wellesley Institute in Toronto that documents extremely well like racism faced by First Nations peoples in the healthcare. And there were these reports for many different communities, not only First Nations, Inuit, Métis, but like Black community, Asian communities. And so like I can share my personal narratives as well, like what I've experienced, but this is like extremely well documented in terms of what happens in healthcare institutions. I also think of like the death of Joyce Echequan, also in 2020. She passed away in a Quebec emergency department, and she had to really sadly and horrifically document her own death in the emergency department by way of video off of her phone, I guess, because of the medical racism that she was facing for not being taken seriously as a patient in the emergency department. And so having personally grappled with like entering medical training with that knowledge of like what I learned and had to unlearn around Indigenous health and injustices in the context of Canada, was learning about how can I be an ally to that kind of work, how do I be an accomplice to that kind of work, and how do I even enter this really like harmful system of that we know as medicine that has historically and ongoing perpetuates a lot of harm. Like many more examples of like nutritional experimentation, forced sterilization of female bodies, and the list kind of goes on with respect to how medicine as a profession, as an institution, has been able to normalize, validate horrific things like systems of knowledge like eugenics and the dehumanization of certain bodies. And so of course, so that's my long answer. Of course, there is racism, overt and covert racism within institutions, like healthcare institutions, and they manifest in all these different ways, right? Because of the system of thinking. And so it's with that framing that I think we have to have that kind of conversation of why we're seeing what we're seeing in terms of First Nations, Inuit, Métis patients do not have the same health outcomes as the next patient. It worries me so much that there's so much documented, and yet how do we actually commit to changing these things? I think that speaks to it's what we do when you know better, then you have to do better. And I often do see a lot of inaction around moving forward. So I think bringing it back into the context of what we're seeing now as a global community with targeting of healthcare workers and infrastructure and patients in Gaza is we need to call out injustices when they happen in real time. Otherwise, we're going to unfortunately be in a position where we have apologies, we have truth and reconciliation efforts after the fact that a genocide has taken place.
One thing that you said about a physician's responsibility, you had written a letter to the Association of Faculties of Medicine in Canada, and in that letter you quoted a doctor who said, "Physicians are the attorneys of the poor." Do you believe that healthcare professionals have a unique duty to speak up during times of conflict and genocide?
Yes, I do. I think that is the bare minimum, right? So the quote comes from Dr. Virchow, and very early on, I think it was the first week of medical school here at the University of Ottawa, where he was quoted, and that's because the work of physicians, the work of that intimate work of working individually with a patient, knowing about the causes of disease and suffering, and that it's not, oftentimes, almost always, it's not fundamentally related to just the disease pathology itself. It's related to the broader social determinants of health, and we can also call it the structural determinants of health or colonial determinants of health, as many other scholars have. And it's these things that we all know to be true that is important for our health, like food security, housing, income, education, but also the impacts of colonization. And so when you are a physician and you're looking after patients, and ultimately you're looking after a community, if you're looking after multiple patients within said population, said community, then you are privy to understand at a very relational and deep way the fundamental causes of disease and suffering within that community. And to not acknowledge those root causes and to not speak about them in some way, to not do something about them in some way, is a failure to kind of maintain the oath that we swore to enter the profession to look after patients and communities. So the work of physicians is inherently political because you understand those different contexts. At least you can try your best to understand where patients are coming from. And then even more intimately, if you're from that community that you're looking after, there's certainly an obligation to call more attention to the root causes of disease and suffering. So with what's happening in the world now, to not speak up, I think is a complete moral and professional failure. Because this is why we train to do what we do, is to look after people and to call attention to the root causes of disease and suffering. And specifically for my framing, also in public health and preventive medicine, is that we try to understand these broader contexts even further with different tools and methods. And when you do that, you are trying to look after a population, trying to understand a population further so that you can improve their health. But when that population, when different populations that you're looking at and your heart goes out to is under siege, under direct violence or genocide, of course there is an obligation to speak up and to call attention to the root causes of disease and suffering.
Would you say that because the work of physicians, as you said, is inherently political and involves kind of an intersectional approach with policy, that there exists kind of this fear in the medical community, or this fear among medical students or people working in public health for speaking out?
I mean, I think there's always some degree of like fear of backlash. To call attention to the root causes in disease and suffering is to call attention to systems of oppression that are often very systemic and systematic, and there for a reason, right? It's like who benefits from those systems of oppression, and you have backlash happening in many different forms when people call out things like sexism in the medical profession, when people call out even the most decent things looking back, like the role of smoking and tobacco companies. You're going to get backlash then and now. So you're always going to have the opponents, I guess, of very well-intentioned advocacy, if you want to call it, or like calling attention to the root causes of disease and suffering, because there are very real reasons why those systems of oppression exist for the benefit of the oppressor, and it's often very really complex systems that take place, but I think it's really important to still speak up and call attention to those systems of oppression, but I'm not seeing this kind of like chilling effect, this kind of fear and reprisal until the issue of Palestine comes up. I think there's a lot of articles and opinion pieces about why that is, so I won't get into that, but the fear is quite real because of what happened to me and many others, and people precariously experience that psychological harm and trauma through me and have expressed those concerns with me. And it's horrific to see institutions in the West perpetuate anti-Palestinian racism as it manifests itself as a lot of self-censorship through fear.
I think that brings us to the resignation from the CMA. Completely understand if you're unable to answer the specifics of this question, but you had said in your resignation statement that there were reasonable opportunities to find a path forward together, but ultimately the attempts to repair the harm that you faced, which is something that we just discussed from the CMA leadership, were unsuccessful. What kind of harm was that, and what did the efforts to repair look like in that context?
So what happened with the Canadian Medical Association, or the CMA, the organization that represents all physicians and medical learners in Canada at a national level? I was on their board of directors as their resident board director, one of only two learners on the board. And when leadership of that organization was made aware of certain social media posts that I had shared, and once again taken out of context and framed in a certain way that upheld certain interpretation of those posts, and value those certain interpretations over others, put me in an environment where I had to explain and defend myself to multiple people, go through multiple conversations, that acknowledging harm that other people experienced, acknowledging the uncomfortable nature of what they were feeling. But I think to equate what I was putting out into the world, to acknowledge health and human rights for Palestinians, and to equate those things to a call for genocide of Jewish Israeli people, to equate that to the killing, to justifying and killing and supporting the killing of innocent Jewish Israeli people on October 7th, and to describe certain things in the way that they did about the killing of those civilians, and to directly equate my actions to that, I think is horrifically wrong and inappropriate and unprofessional. I can only experience as harassment, bullying, and intimidation because that is how I experienced it. And also there were just questions of my competency, like my competency as a physician, my competency in my future work, current work as a public health and preventive medicine person or physician, in that I wouldn't be able to provide like equitable care for the Jewish community in Canada. And the example that was given was that I would not be able to respond effectively to a communicable disease outbreak affecting kosher food had it happen in Canada, and I was the person responsible to respond to that as a public health physician, that my competency in that way was being questioned because of social media posts that were highlighting the importance of standing for health and human rights for Palestinians. These are just some examples of what I went through. Ultimately, we had a very long mediated legal conversation and process to try to find a path forward. And ultimately, I think the path forward just felt so inconsistent with my values and principles, and I see that the organization as a whole continues to remain silent around the unfolding genocide that has surpassed, the 100-day mark. The hypocrisy and the double standards of this medical institution that says it represents all physicians and medical learners in Canada is just extremely egregious. So some examples include, they put out a statement on racism when the Black Lives Matters protests escalated in summer of 2020. And, interestingly, that was the year that they created more statements and work around racism, as if it wasn't, as if racism wasn't a thing before 2020. And when the escalation of conflict happened between Ukraine and Russia in spring of 2022, the Canadian Medical Association put out multiple statements in support of Ukraine, including going as far as committing to divestments, financial investments of anything tied to the Russian Federation. And we have criticism of the BDS movement for Palestine. And they also went as far as to commit $250,000 of humanitarian aid and support for the emergency response in and around Ukraine for Ukrainians. And so we know what's possible. The world is bearing witness to what is happening in Gaza, and yet they still remain silent. It was only this week where the British Medical Association, so like the equivalent organization for the CMA in the UK, has called for a ceasefire, including many other conditions, such as very basic things that shouldn't take 100 days of a genocide to take place, but it did, and very decent things like stop attacking hospitals and healthcare infrastructure and respect international law. And so because the British Medical Association put something out like that, it really made me reflect this morning about the Canadian Medical Association, their complicitness, things that I've thought about long and hard already. That's why I'm sharing what I'm sharing now around these double standards, around the hypocrisy of these kinds of responses, but from Western medical institutions, which is really just a manifestation of structural racism and anti-Palestinian racism, and it's well documented now. But when people know better, and the evidence continues to speak for itself from journalists on the ground in Gaza, it's never too late to do the right thing. I think we need to continue to demand much more from like all parties involved, right, including the Canadian government, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
I think this brings us to your reinstatement at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Medicine. What was the process like of being reinstated, or when did you find out that you were going to be reinstated?
I can't say that I'm reinstated because the School of Epidemiology and Public Health kind of shared that yesterday on multiple social media platforms. I will say the way in which it was initially conveyed to me was extremely unsettling, that there was no acknowledgement of the harm that I experienced from not having a conversation even before the suspension, and only having an opportunity to defend myself after they initiated this adversarial process 3 weeks into my suspension, and they kind of expect me to like forget about everything that happened, it seems, and that I can just continue on in my training as if that's a favor given to me. And so I think that is just unacceptable and egregious to me, that that is the position that I am in currently. So I continue to have conversations with the faculty around a path forward, if that path forward makes sense, that I even remain in the institution, because this is also an institution that's not only perpetuated a lot of harm to myself, but a lot of other people that have witnessed what's happened to me and are following it. And so I'm trying to figure out if there's even a path with this institution with me involved, because I've given this institution so much of my life, as I mentioned, like almost 8 years now. And I've done so much work around health advocacy and health equity work, like in the context of Indigenous health, but also other areas of advocacy that I was involved with at the federal and provincial levels. And the university has like written articles about me upon my graduation from that school, and has highlighted my other health equity work when I worked in Iqaluit and Nunavut in the north. And for them to benefit from my work that centers patients and communities, and for them to turn around and do this to me, I think is extremely, like I don't know how, it's not for me to repair the harm. I think they need to reach out and actually acknowledge the harm that they did. But my work has never been about propping up this institution. It was always been about centering patients and community, and doing the work that I felt was really important in ways that I felt were reasonable and right in those moments. I will acknowledge, harm that I've caused inadvertently, but that's for me to do, and with the parties that have experienced harm. And I expect the same of the university. I expect the same of this institution, but they have so far as yet not done that. And it's been quite some time. They had a lot of time to probably do that. And so my work will continue to be for patients and for community. And if that means it's not within this institution, then I'm more than okay with it, because we should never center institutions. I think they are meant to serve people and communities, and not the other way around.
So a petition to reinstate you has gotten over 90,000 signatures. Did that petition play a role in your reinstatement?
I honestly don't know. I like to think that it did, because people took the time to sign the petition and to read about it, to circulate it, to share it, and amplify it. I wasn't involved in that petition whatsoever. There are people that care a lot about me and care a lot about the issue of anti-Palestinian racism, and rightfully so. And I think it really speaks to the how much care people have around this issue and this case. But the way in which I had a professionalism hearing with the university, the way that it unfolded, that there's no indication that they took it into consideration. But with how much time and effort people put in and bore witness to what was happening to me, I really hope it helped people think and reflect and take a step back. To that, I think it might have done, for sure, and I think there's still a lot of learning that people are doing now, and that's not all for any of us to do or hold. I think people have their own learning to do. I've done my best to share, educate, find common ground, and that's all I can do.
Wonderful. Just kind of wrapping up a little bit, I know you talked a little bit about your future in medicine and your future in public health and what your ultimate goal is. If you'd like to discuss that more, that would be the time. Or if there's anything else that maybe we didn't ask or you didn't get to touch on that you'd like to share, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this space, an opportunity to reflect a little bit. I've certainly had a lot of time to reflect and think about these things. I think there's still a lot that I've yet to process. And there are, like, it's like day by day, week by week, figuring out like what is the best path forward, and what is the best path forward, like, for myself, in navigating this really challenging environment, but also continuing to bear witness what's happening in the world and contributing my time and energy in a way that makes most sense to my values and principles in terms of supporting other colleagues that are facing reprisals and suspensions, expulsions even, and also thinking about where are my skills and how do I best leverage those skills and experiences so that I can be most effective for other people that have also supported me. I would not be where I am right now without amazing people in my life, and also new people, amazing new people in my life that have been able to provide me like a lot of space to process and grieve. A lot of, like, this is not what I expected to go, but what's done is done. We can't change the past, but I am looking forward to like charting whatever new path looks for will look like in the coming days. But it also depends on how other people react, and I can't control those things. But I can control how I respond mindfully to others. I can control how I will continue to listen and process and make decisions that are aligned with my values and principles, but also be okay with changing those with new information. But I've been yet to be provided with anything to make me to question my moral stance, I think, right? And so that's what's guiding me for now, hopefully I can share more about what's to come, but there's just also a lot of unknowns and active conversations happening. So maybe it'll be different tomorrow, maybe it'll be different next week. So I won't preempt anything at this point. But I appreciate the question, and we'll see.
Thank you so much.
This is the end of our interview. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you had a good time, and I look forward to seeing what you do in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.